Howdy. Welcome to Ausgrave Royalty. I am Justin. We're here with episode 3 of our current season video series on Jung and his answer to Job and Edinger's Archetype of the Apocalypse. Highly encourage y'all to check out the previous episodes if y'all haven't already. But got a lot to cover, so we'll just hop right into it. As you can see from the title of the video, it's a pretty big and nuanced topic and even just from the title, some psychological implications. Y'all ever seen the movie It Follows? I enjoyed the movie. I have no urge to see it again, but if you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing, I'd say. And I don't like very many horror movies, but as we'll see, we'll kind of get into how that relates to God becoming man. That's what this episode's all about, and it's a nuanced part of this line of thinking that Jung and Edinger are articulating. So it's worth understanding. In the last episode, we covered that even God himself, according to Jung and Edinger, is on his own journey of individuation. And morbidly, potentially, it may be the reason or maybe a coincidence. I doubt it's a coincidence, but maybe somewhere in between. Humanity seems to be the vessel for God becoming more individuated. Like, I wonder if that is the whole point of humanity, for God to learn more about himself through interacting with his creation. It sounds bizarre that God would need man for his own evolution, and yet that's what this Job story is sort of implying in a way. So the theory goes. Edinger says, the ego is the outward occasion for an inward process of dialectic in the self. That's a very academic way of saying what I was just saying, like that each of us who have an ego, humanity, it's just, we're basically puppets that are inert, waiting for God to like pull the strings. And as he's doing that and acting out the lives of these egos, he's learning about himself and evolving. I know it's a little crazy, but yes, I have in my notes here. In a chilling expression, Edinger describes the experience of the ego encountering the self as a feeling as if it's easy prey, like surrendering to one's rage, frustration, lust, etc. You feel these sensations are going to get a hold of you. You're going to be hearing terms coming up called like the Holy Ghost, Son of Man, the Incarnation, the Paraclete. All these terms are synonymous for the same idea, that the next step in God's individuation process is to live through all of us, each individual human. And this is in stark contrast to Jesus, whereby God incarnated in a single man. There's a little bit of a pun there, but you understand, like, the evolution is from a single individual man to incarnating in all of humanity. The next evolution is that God will be erupting through all of us via the unconscious, otherwise known as the self, with a capital S, so the theory goes. Yeah, God is always coming for us, just like it in It Follows. And he always finds us, whether consciously or unconsciously. And remember that one of Jung's famous quotes is, "What we fail to make conscious will be acted out unconsciously, and we will call it fate." Let me say that again. What we fail to make conscious will be acted out unconsciously, and we will call it fate. And this gets to the heart of how God acts through us and with us. Basically, we can, it's like, in life, in dreams, like, often your lifestyle or the state of your life is often symbolized by a vehicle. So if it's like a bus that says certain things, maybe you feel like you're carrying a lot of other people psychologically, or maybe it's a sports car or whatever. Each vehicle has its own, maybe it's damaged, maybe it is in disrepair, maybe it's dusty or the paint's worn and you're worn out, burnt out, whatever. And it makes me think, like, often we have this expression like you're on autopilot through life. And that movie, like Adam Sandler movie Click, I think, was like about that, fast forwarding through the boring parts. And that's the epitome of unconsciousness. So it's like you're driving in your car, aka living your life. Go with the symbolism here. And then all of a sudden, like Knight Rider, or Transformers, the car kind of just takes control and isn't listening to your inputs of gas and brake and steering. It's just kind of taken over. And that's kind of like, God working through us. And it also reminds me of that Terminator speech, like, listen and understand that Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop ever until you are dead. And it's funny, but that is exactly what's happening here. That's a good, albeit a morbid take on what the theory is of God acting through us, learning about himself through us, and then we die, basically. I mean, our lives are basically fuel for God's understanding of himself. I feel like I've said the same thing a lot in the last few minutes, but it's worth it, because this idea, I mean, it's obviously nuclear if you really accept it, but it's also got some, as we'll go through, Edinger has some good observations, like when you accept this or understand it, like what results from it. So, yeah, Jung and Edinger call this kind of landscape of, God hunting us down to, be enacted in the world. And they call it the divine drama. And TLDR, every moment of our lives is a Job situation. And if you grasp that, you're going to get the paradigm here. Every moment. Because every moment you're in the car, metaphorically, right? And Edinger says that the story of Job encountering God is analogous to the ego encountering the self. This is such a brilliant insight. So he says, I think the term divine drama refers to the progressive dramatic evolution and unfolding of the objective psyche in the course of emerging life, and in the course of human history. Like, that's really important. The term divine drama refers to the progressive, dramatic evolution and unfolding of the objective psyche, God's psyche, in the course of emerging life and in the course of human history. This idea of a divine drama is totally missing from the scientific worldview, which is the predominant worldview today. It's heretical, according to the scientific worldview, to consider the possibility of purposefulness in the evolutionary sequence. That sort of thinking is not permitted. If you submit a paper to a scientific journal that contains that hypothesis, it won't get published. This means our effects are the inner manifestations of Yahweh. Yahweh's the perpetrator of the deed that caused it. So the effect and its cause correspond to each other. Our effects are the inner manifestations of Yahweh. Period. This is a crucial understanding. If you don't get this, you will not understand Answer to Job. You won't be able to apply it in any personal or practical or genuine way. It will just remain an abstraction. And again, I've said it a lot on this channel. This is Archetypes. You're not dancing in the woods. You're not sniffing crystals. You're not, reading the stars or like tossing runes or I Ching or whatever. Archetypes are psychic paradigms that are eminently practical in human life. This is not New Age. This is very practical in everyday life. So the theory goes. Now this is so important here. This is Edinger still. If I fall into a rage or a passion of any kind, in the terms of this book that we are studying, those phenomena are manifestations of Yahweh. That won't be hard for you to accept once you accept one other equation, namely, Yahweh equals the unconscious. It won't be hard for you to accept that effects are products of the unconscious. We don't generate them. They happen to us. Yahweh equals the unconscious. For the purpose of Answer to Job, that's the equation to keep in mind. Jung tells us that Job's encounter with Yahweh had the effect of constellating or activating or bringing into visibility the perpetual hierosgamos, which means sacred marriage. It's an alchemical term, also known as the conjunctio, which then led to the transformation of Yahweh. So, Job encountering Yahweh is akin to the ego encountering the unconscious. And when that happens, Yahweh, when the light of the ego, the little spotlight in the universe, the vast universe of the unconscious, when the little spotlight highlights a piece of the unconscious, whoop, it transforms. Now it's visible. The ego, the consciousness is focusing on it. Thus, there's a change in the universe of the unconscious. Whatever you might think, this new evolution of God and the psyche has the benefit, and this is so important, it has the benefit of depersonalization. Depersonalization, as Edinger describes. It's an antidote to narcissism, if you can accept it. And, I'm not a professional therapist, blah, 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 but I understand narcissism to be on a spectrum. And we all have some of it. And you also you might hear in this literature being inflated or having an inflated ego or experiencing inflation. This is an increase in narcissism. And so when you accept this paradigm that everything you do is tied in with God acting through you, it kind of makes you feel small, but in a good way. That not the things we do or regret, or like if we lose our temper and we just like lose it. You know, that's an expression, we lose it. We're losing the ego. God has now taken over, aka the unconscious, the self, and is using us as a puppet to enact that unconscious knowledge out into the real world, which is what it both wants and doesn't want, which we'll get to, I think, in the next episode. The nuances of God, aka the unconscious self, being a container of opposites. Remember, just, you know, the Job story tells us that our advocate and our adversary are in the same entity, the unconscious, in God. And there's a huge insight, which I bet a bunch of y'all have already guessed, coming up. But it helps us, like, if we just don't feel like we're enough, or, you know, whatever hang up you might have. And don't misunderstand, depression, as the great Robert L. Moore has stated, depression is an inflated state. And this is so critical. When you're depressed, you think it's implied that there's a loss of something significant. Like, I'm very significant and not doing well, therefore I'm depressed. I'm butchering the whole, probably vast literature on the nuances of being depressed, which I never have been. So I'm speaking as an ignorant layman here. But if you will, I believe, yeah, Robert L. Moore, like, there's a certain narcissism to thinking that you matter that much to be so concerned with yourself, you know? You're preoccupied with your lack of ability. But you're a pitiful human compared to God, aka the unconscious. This is what this is saying. Forget all that. Like, there are forces at work that are that you're being swept up in, and they're, you know, being depressed is part of that. Is part of the divine drama. So if you can accept that this is just God and the unconscious evolving through your depressive state, or whatever state you're in, you're like, oh, I'm not the center of the universe. I'm a piece of this stochastic tinkering. I'm a piece of this ongoing cosmic conversation God is using humanity for to learn more about himself. You know, I don't know. For me, that's a comforting thought. Now, I don't want to, like, make this too complicated, but there is a question about free will, right? That comes up here. Like, and coming from the philosophical background, you need free will for ethics, right? Because if there's right and wrong, good and bad, it's the choice that matters. Like, you have to have a choice in order to have ethics. Now, if you take this all the way, then, you know, no one has ever done anything right or wrong. Everyone has just basically been this pitiful puppet that God is, you know, the puppet master of. And he's just like, you know, he's like, mama, 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 mama. And that's like all of humanity's history and life. Just God puppeting, you know, and like, you know, acting out all these things so that he can learn about himself. But when he's doing that, this is lives of humans flashing by, you know, dying of sickness, grief, revenge, rage, inadequacy, depression. He's just puppeting every single experience he can to try and learn more about himself. This is like the theory. But if all we are is that, literally, then it kind of diminishes free will. And we don't have time for that debate, certainly. There's still more to cover, especially in this video, much less this season. Let me know in the comments below how y'all would reconcile that. For me, it may sound cheap, but screw it. I see all these paradigms and ideas, grand though they are, they really come to life when you use them as a tool. So, what do I mean? Like, even statisticians, right? I don't think they take their own science very seriously. Because let's say there's the famous statistic that most car wrecks happen within like your nearby area of where you live. That's a statistic. So if people took that seriously, they would say, "Oh, well, I'm not going to go anywhere, right? Because statistically, I have a high chance of being in a wreck, right?" But nobody does that. Nobody thinks about that. In the same way, like when I hear like, "Oh, well, if you believe this theory, then you can't have free will." Logically, I can see that perspective, although I'm sure there's nuances and debates worth having, blah, blah, blah. I haven't come to a conclusion on that reconciliation. What I can say is that this paradigm is useful as a tool, aka if you're depressed, if you're frustrated, if you're feeling behind in life or inadequate, or you've lost your temper, you have regrets. Now you pull this tool out and say, "Hey, I'm just part of this ongoing divine drama to help God learn about himself." Yes, it could be a cope, right? But I think it's useful. And if it's making lives better and bringing some kind of peace for you to then plant your feet and take action to better your life psychically or otherwise, then it's useful. This channel is all about practicality, even though we're discussing the most esoteric subjects. That's like my secret, objective, to remind y'all, everyone, that esoteric concepts do have an eminently practical applications, right? So that was a huge rant. Edinger says, Jung goes on to say in this footnote that when we understand that what we are dealing with is divine unconsciousness and lack of reflection, then we are enabled to form a conception of God which puts his actions beyond moral judgment and allows no conflict to arise between goodness and beastliness. What Jung is describing here is the nature of the unconscious. That is huge. That is nuclear. Because this answers, I told you all earlier, there's a big thing coming up, and this is it. This answers, why is there evil in the world? Because evil is part of the divine drama. God is the container of goodness and beastliness in the same entity. And that dynamism is what the back and forth is what the divine drama is, God learning about himself. That's how you reconcile evil in the world, TLDR. Seems like a nuclear revelation. Because why is there evil in the world is has been one of the most important questions of mankind for forever. Edinger says, in terms of Job and Yahweh, it would mean that Job's consciousness of Yahweh's nature grows. That as Job's consciousness of Yahweh grows, Yahweh is transformed. It is a real disadvantage to be omnipotent, to be immortal. In fact, as far as I can tell, consciousness can only develop in mortal creatures. I don't believe it's possible for consciousness to develop in immortal creatures, if there be such a thing. In other words, the archetypes themselves cannot evolve into full consciousness without being routed through a mortal ego to bring that consciousness into realization. What that means is that injustice, especially if it is consciously perceived constellates, manifests its correction in the other, in the unconscious or in the outside world. In other words, injustice consciously perceived and born constellates justice. This is really quite a fundamental psychological law, Edinger says. You cannot be a conscious being unless you experience... you cannot be a conscious being unless you can't experience weakness and defeat. So, yeah, the way consciousness is progressively developed out of the original condition of ego self and identity. The original condition is inflation. The infantile psyche is in a state of identification with the self, and it is the state of inflation. It is identified with the deity. Very progressively, if life provides the right lessons through rejections and defeats and experiences of weakness, it gradually becomes conscious. And you go through that cycle again and again. Each time it goes around, there's a little increase in consciousness. Yeah, so you cannot be a conscious being unless you can, I think that's a typo, experience weakness and defeat. Because each time you experience weakness and defeat, you grow more conscious. Edinger says, Job's knowledge of God has the effect of making God conscious of the relatedness principle, because someone found him in a state of unrelatedness and perceived that condition. That perception itself had the effect of correcting the situation. One thing I think is meant by this, Edinger says, is that consciousness of the violent, unrelated power aspect of the unconscious transforms it. I believe this process takes place both in regards to one's self-knowledge, in which one observes the violent power aspect of one's own unconscious, and I believe it operates also in relation to the knowledge of others. And before we end, I want to try and articulate all this in yet another image. And what this reminds me of is the quantum mechanics experiment, the split screen experiment. I'll link it below. Really good video. Talk about a real horror movie. Now, yeah, this is the type of thing that keeps me up at night. So the split screen experiment, let me see if I can describe it quickly here. Basically, there was a gun that shot electrons at a board, and it when the scientists set it up and it fired the electrons, it produced, let's say, a pattern. Let's call it pattern X. Now, when they fired the same electrons, they fired it at a board through a split screen, so it produced a certain pattern. Now, when they did that again, but no one observed it, the pattern changed. Everything else being the same gun, the same board configuration. Now, the pattern was different when they fired it. How creepy is that? So when observed, reality changes, right? This is what the ego is doing when it illuminates something in the unconscious. The unconscious changes, like someone freezing in the spotlight, Watch that video. Yeah, I hope y'all got something out of this. It's I felt like I repeated myself a lot, but it's worth it if you can get the paradigm, and it'll just, again, it's a tool in the psychological toolbox you can pull out in hard times to realize this is just part of the divine drama, right? All right. Well, I'll see y'all in the next episode. Comment down below, and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.